Pansychism is everything conscious. Introduction. Imagine pointing a consciousness meter at the world around you. Point it at your pet dog. It beeps wildly, detecting a rich inner life. Aim it at a houseplant. Maybe it flickers, a faint suggestion of awareness. How about a humble toaster or a drifting cloud? Most of us assume those would register a flat zero. After all, a toaster couldn't have feelings, could it? Yet a curious philosophical idea asks us to reconsider. It's called panpsychism. In other words, everything might have some minuscule spark of mind. Panpsychism sounds strange, even wacko at first blush. But as we delve into humanity's understanding of consciousness, from ancient wisdom to cutting-edge science, we'll see why some thinkers, past and present, take this idea seriously. Consciousness is the most intimate fact of our existence. The vivid feeling of being here, experiencing the world, yet it remains an enduring mystery. How and why? This conundrum, dubbed the hard problem of consciousness, perhaps consciousness isn't generated by complex brains alone, but is instead a quality inherent to matter itself in this narrative journey. From the musings of ancient Greek philosophers who said everything is full of gods, to the Monads of Leibniz and the radical ideas of William James, hearing from contemporary champions like Galen Strawson, David Chalmers, and Philip Goff, who argue that panpsychism might resolve our mental mysteries. Along the way, we'll integrate insights from neuroscience and AI, examining whether consciousness could pervade complex networks, and look at intriguing hints from quantum physics, like the odd role of observers in quantum theory. We'll also pit panpsychism against its critic, the illusionists who claim consciousness is a trick of the brain, and the materialists who insist mind emerges only at higher complexity throughout. A playful consciousness meter will recur, testing various entities. Plant. By the end, we'll reflect on the ethical and existential implications. If mind is everywhere, even in the lowliest particle, how might that change our relationship to nature, technology, and ourselves? The topic is heady, but fear not, we'll keep the tone accessible and narrative-driven, balancing philosophy with examples from pop culture, from Her to Westworld to Blade Runner 2049, to bring these ideas to life. So, take a deep breath, keep your mind open, and let's set off on this exploration of consciousness in all the unlikely places it might reside. Historical roots of panpsychism. Panpsychism may seem like a wild modern idea. In fact, some of the earliest recorded philosophers intuited that mind is a fundamental feature of the world. The term panpsychism comes from Greek pan, all, and psyche, soul or mind, but even before the term existed, thinkers were grappling with how matter and mind relate. One of the first was Thales of Miletus, c. 624 545 BCE. Often hailed as the first philosopher, Thales famously claimed that a magnet has a soul because it can move iron. From that small observation, he leapt to a grand analogy: if a magnet shows a lifelike property, motion. Aristotle later reports that Thales believed all things are full of gods, a poetic way to say Thales' exact views are lost in time, but tradition credits him with championing the ubiquity of animation. A clear glimmer of panpsychist thought, another early Greek. He taught that the underlying principle of everything is air pneuma, which in Greek also meant breath, spirit, or soul. Because air pervades the world, so does this life breath or mind-like quality in Anaximander's view. The cosmos isn't a dead machine. It's infused with pneuma, a continuum of spirit, connecting all things likewise. These pre-Socratics weren't exactly saying a rock thinks like you or me, rather. They blurred the line between living and non-living, suggesting a continuity between matter and life. The question they faced was a dilemma. Either mind is elemental, or it somehow emerges later from non-mind. Many early philosophers leaned toward mind being elemental in some form, lest they invoke mysterious emergence. Plato, in his later works, toyed with the idea of a world soul in the Timaeus. He asserts it would be dreadful to imagine the universe devoid of life and mind. Moving forward to the 17th century, panpsychism found new formulations. 1677 advanced a bold monism, in which all of reality is one substance, God or nature, with infinite attributes, two of which we know are thought and extension, mind and matter. In Spinoza's view, every individual thing, whether a person, a planet, or a pebble, is a mode of that one substance, and has both a physical aspect and a mental aspect. For every physical form, there's an idea of that form in the attribute of thought. Spinoza doesn't say stones think human thoughts, but he does imply that even the tiniest particle has a spark of mind, an internal idea of itself, just as it has extension in space. In other words, mind is ubiquitous not as full-blown consciousness in every speck, but as an intrinsic aspect of existence. As one commentator puts it, any proper reading of Spinoza will entail some form of panpsychism. Spinoza provided a unified picture. Neither mind nor matter is reducible to the other. They are two sides of the same coin. Around the same time, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646-1716, proposed a universe. Leibniz's monadology is essentially a panpsychist metaphysics. Monads are the fundamental units of reality, and each monad is like a tiny mind, endowed with perception and appetite. Perception in monads means each has internal, subjective states of primitive experience of the universe. We must conceive of them on the model of souls. Everything in nature, then, is composed of these mind-like entities. Even a rock, for Leibniz, is not truly a single thing, but an aggregation of countless monads, each with its own micro-perceptions, complex bodies, giving a unified consciousness, whereas mere aggregates like a heap of stones have no single dominant monad. Still, even the heap of stones has monad souls in its parts. There is a world of creatures, living beings, animals, soul. In the least part of matter is a beautiful image. Zoom in far enough, and even the dust mote teems with tiny lives across the pond in America. William James, 1842. 1910, the famed psychologist-philosopher, wrestled with panpsychism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. James initially doubted the idea that many small minds could fuse into a big mind. He called this the mind-dust theory and flagged the combination problem, which we'll soon discuss. But interestingly, James evolved on the issue in his monumental Principles of Psychology, 1890. He displayed sympathy to panpsychism, and by 1909 he openly endorsed a form of it in his 1909 book, A Pluralistic Universe. Building blocks that are neither inherently mental nor physical, but can be seen as both, he came to a general view of the world, almost identical with Fechner's. Gustav Fechner was a German panpsychist. James ultimately wrote of a great empirical movement towards a pluralistic panpsychic view of the universe. This is a striking turnaround. One of the founding fathers of modern psychology, embracing the idea that mind stuff pervades reality, James recognized. In fact, he famously wrote in 1890, "If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things." In other words, James's late-life panpsychism was a pluralistic one, meaning he saw the universe as comprised of many discrete centers of experience. This set the stage for later debates on how these many bits of awareness relate and combine. By the turn of the 20th century, even some physicists sounded strikingly panpsychist. The Nobel-winning physicist Max Planck, for example, I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. His contemporaries Erwin Schrödinger, another physics Nobelist muse, and Louis de Broglie thought of matter and mind as two aspects of one thing. Such remarks show that the idea of mind permeating nature wasn't only in the philosophic ivory tower. It was being considered by scientists grappling with quantum mysteries. Consciousness meter a houseplant. Before we proceed to modern panpsychism, let's pause for a playful experiment. Suppose we take our imaginary consciousness meter a gadget that lights up if something is conscious and bring it to a quiet corner of the room where a potted plant sits. Say hello to your houseplant and scan it with the meter. Does the needle move at all? The device might register only the faintest blip. To all appearances, the plant just sits there, silently growing. But consider this. The plant responds to sunlight by turning its leaves. It knows to extend roots toward nourishment. And some research even suggests plants can communicate or remember in rudimentary ways. Is it totally mindless? Panpsychism would say the plant, in its own alien and dim way, Experience is something. The meter's slight flicker invites us to wonder, could a simple living thing possess a tiny spark of awareness? It may not feel like we do, but perhaps there's something it is like to be a plant. However sparse or diffuse, we're so used to defining consciousness by animal brains. Yet the line between reactive life and sentient life might not be a razor gap, but a gradient, the hard problem of consciousness. We must confront what David Chalmers famously dubbed the hard problem of consciousness. Stated simply, the hard problem asks why and how do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? Why is there something it is like to see the color red, feel pain, or taste coffee, rather than these brain processes just going on in the dark with no awareness? Neuroscience, the electrical spikes, the chemical signals, the regions that activate when you recognize a face or report a feeling, these are sometimes called the easy problems of consciousness, explaining the functions and mechanisms. But even if we map every neural connection and calculate every information processing step, a question remains. Why does all that processing feel like something from the inside? Why isn't a brain just a clever computer processing inputs and outputs? This explanatory gap between the brain's objective workings is what Chalmers highlighted. He noted that one could imagine a hypothetical creature called a zombie, an exact physical replica of a human, molecule for molecule, that behaves identically to us, but has no conscious experience. If conceivable, suggests that no amount of structural functional description automatically explains the presence of consciousness. In philosophical terms, there seems to be an unbridgeable gap between the third-person facts of the brain and the first-person fact of the mind consciousness. We can explain life in biological terms. We can explain heat as molecular motion. But we struggle to explain consciousness as just neural activity. This is why some have called it the explanatory gap, or even the mystery of mystery. Chalmers observed that any purely physical explanation leaves a residue after explaining what the brain does. Why isn't it all just processing without any inner feeling? This indicates that perhaps something is missing in our picture of nature as given by physical science. Traditional scientific approaches assume that if you simulate all the functions of the brain, it's plausible that one could have all the functions without the phenomenal experience, which suggests consciousness is an extra fact about the world, not captured by physical description, alone reactions. Some, like illusionists, deny there is a deep problem at all. They claim our sense of an ineffable inner experience. Others, called Mysterians, think the problem is unsolvable by human minds. But interestingly, one prominent category of responses, if the physicalist framework matter, as described by physics, doesn't naturally include consciousness. Rather, it was there from the start. This doesn't mean your coffee mug has complex thought. Pansychism isn't saying atoms write poetry instead. It posits that the basic constituents of reality, whether they be atoms, quantum fields. In this view, what we call consciousness in human is just a higher order manifestation of something that exists in simpler form in all matter. Thus, it's built into the universe's fabric, like an intrinsic property. One way to frame this is dual aspect monism, also known as Russellian monism, after Bertrand Russell. The idea is that physical science, by design, describes structure and behavior of matter mass. As Russell and others argued, physics tells us what matter does, not what matter is in itself, perhaps the inside of matter. Its intrinsic nature is mental or experiential, whereas the outside is physical structure. This would neatly solve the hard problem. Consciousness doesn't magically emerge from non-conscious matter. Rather, matter was never purely non-conscious to begin with. The brain is a highly complex organization of matter, and thus it presents a highly complex form of consciousness. As philosopher Galen Strawson puts it, if we take consciousness seriously as real, and we take matter as all there is, the only viable conclusion may be that matter itself can manifest consciousness. Hence, Galen Strawson is one of the leading voices making this case. He argues that, he says, would be a brute emergence akin to magic. Instead, Strawson suggests a true physicalist, one who believes everything is physical, should accept that experience is a fundamental feature of the physical world. Otherwise, one is sneaking in something wholly non-experiential for which we have no evidence. Why insist that matter is inherently non-experiential, totally mindless. That, Strawson says bluntly, is silly. His point is that it's weirder to assume some bits of reality have absolutely no interior life than to suppose every bit of reality has some interior aspect, however rudimentary, that can combine and evolve. The analogy he often uses is life. People once found it magical that life could come from non-life, but biochemistry showed how complex organization yields life function. Yet, Strawson notes, you can imagine life emerging from non-living chemistry without logical contradiction, whereas he argues you could explain metabolism and reproduction in molecular terms. Life reduces to chemistry, but experience doesn't likewise reduce. There's always something left out if you start from zero experience building block. Thus, this line of reasoning is known as the anti-emergence argument for panpsychism. Another key contemporary thinker, Thomas Nagel, who famously wrote What Is It Like to Be a Bat in 1974, similarly hinted that materialist reductionism can't account for consciousness, and he entertained panpsychism as one option. Nagel wrote that if evolution is to make sense, consciousness might go all the way down to the simplest organisms or particles. In 1979, he stated, psychophysical monism, a single substance with both mental and physical aspects, offers an account of the intelligibility derived. The complex from the simple if mental phenomena are themselves part of the most basic level of reality, then their existence doesn't seem miraculous. Paraphrasing Nagel's argument, Philip Goff, a young philosopher and one of today's most vocal panpsychists, Goff notes that Galileo, in founding modern science, deliberately excluded conscious experience from the quantitative domain of physics. This move allowed physics to progress by focusing on mathematics. Goff argues we need to put consciousness back in our scientific worldview by admitting it as a fundamental aspect of matter. He defines panpsychism simply as the view that consciousness is a basic and ubiquitous feature of reality. Goff is optimistic that this view will gain traction in 20 years' time. In his estimation, it's a framework that can unify what we know from the inside consciousness. In Goff's view, was not that science went down the wrong path, whereas it might be missing a huge piece of the puzzle despite its attraction. Panpsychism faces a batteries not included style challenge. Even if every particle has a mind, how do these tiny minds combine to form the big minds we know? Like the human mind, this is known as the combination problem, first clearly framed by William James in 1899. James asked, how can multiple subjects of experience combine into a single unified subject? You can combine matter easily. A bunch of atoms make a molecule, many neurons make a brain. But if each atom has a penny's worth of consciousness, how do you add them up to get the dollar of consciousness that a human has? My conscious field, the unified feeling of being me right now, doesn't seem divisible into dozens of smaller conscious entities if my neurons were conscious. As philosopher David Chalmers quipped, if you can make panpsychism solve the combination problem, it becomes a lead contender. I think it's fair to say no one has solved that one yet. Chalmers calls the combination problem the hard problem for panpsychists. To appreciate it, consider a simple scenario. Suppose electrons have a tiny experience, say, a dim fundamental feeling of existence. A neuron is made of many electrons, protons, etc. Does the neuron have an aggregated experience made of its parts? If so, why don't we detect myriad little electron qualia in our mind? If not, then how does the neuron's own consciousness relate to that of its constituents? Some panpsychists suggest special mechanisms of mental combination or phenomenal bonding that could allow smaller experiences to form larger ones, somewhat like cells forming an organism. Others explore the idea that perhaps the fundamental consciousness isn't in particles individually, but in the entire system. This is called cosmopsychism, if the universe as a whole is the fundamental mind. Chalmers himself has written a detailed analysis of the combination problem, considering whether panpsychist micro-subjects can logically constitute a macro-subject. There's even a twist if one instead assumes the whole universe is one conscious entity, cosmic mind. Then you face a decombination problem. How to get individual minds out of one giant mind? So either direction, it's thorny. Panpsychists are actively debating solutions Some point to analogies in split-brain cases or integrated information discussed later to suggest consciousness, confuse, or split depending on information link. Philosopher Hedda Hassel-Murch, for instance. Others, like philosopher Galen Strawson, brush off the combination problem to an extent, arguing that if small experiences are the only way to build larger ones, then somehow nature accomplishes it, even if we can't imagine how still. Critics argue panpsychists haven't given a satisfying account of combination. They've just relocated it to the gaps between particles. Philosopher Philip Goff acknowledges this is the central issue. There is reason to doubt that the panpsychist herself is able to give a wholly intelligible story as to how macro-level consciousness. We'll see how it plays out, but keep it in mind as the Achilles heel panpsychism must address before leaving the philosophical groundwork. Let's also clarify what panpsychism is. It's not saying that literally everything is conscious. In the same way, it doesn't mean your toaster has beliefs and desires. Panpsychists usually posit that fundamental entities have extremely primitive experience, often called proto-consciousness or pan-experientialism. These proto-experiences might be nothing like human awareness, more like tiny sparks of feeling, or raw qualia. Panpsychism is also distinct from animism, the belief that objects have full-fledged spirits. Most modern panpsychists discuss it in secular, naturalistic terms. It's an attempt to extend the scientific view of nature to include the inside perspective, finally, to address a likely misunderstanding. Panpsychism does not trivially solve the hard problem, rather, it reframes it. It says, roughly, consciousness was there all along, so we don't need to suddenly conjure it out of nothing that eliminates the brute emergence issue. But it raises new questions like combination. However, proponents think it's a promising route because it aligns the existence of consciousness. Rather than treating consciousness as some inexplicable add-on or miracle with a philosophical underpinnings set, we can now look at how these ideas intersect with modern science, where things get even more fascinating. Consciousness in science, neuroscience, AI, and quantum insight, testing the intelligence of animals and AI, and pondering the quantum foundation of reality. How does panpsychism mesh with these scientific insights? Interestingly, some scientific theories of consciousness and findings in neuroscience, the neuroscience of consciousness, brains, and beyond neuroscience, the brain activities that correspond to conscious experience using fMRI, EEG, and other tools. Researchers have found that when you're aware of something, say a picture on the screen, versus not noticing it, certain patterns of widespread brain activity occur. For example, global neuronal workspace theory suggests that when information in the brain is broadcast across many regions, it becomes conscious if it stays localized. In short, consciousness seems to require a high degree of integration of information in the brain patient. So, scientists like to say consciousness is about complex connections and processes in neural networks. They don't yet explain why those brain processes are conscious. Still, they give clues. One promising theoretical framework is the integrated information theory diet of consciousness. Teed posits that consciousness just is the capacity of a system to integrate information. It assigns a numerical value, phi, to a system, representing how much the whole system is more than the sum of its parts in terms of information processing. A simple system that is just a sum of independent parts, or zero, would have no consciousness. A system with high, like a human brain, with billions of interconnections, has a rich consciousness. Strikingly, deity implies that any system with zero has at least a tiny spark of experience. This means even a silicon chip, if it integrates information, not just feeds inputs to outputs independently, but has feedback loops, making the whole state irreducible to separate parts, could have a minuscule consciousness, as Christoph Koch, a prominent neuroscientist and AIT advocate, puts it. Any system with integrated information, different from zero, has consciousness. Any integration feels like something to that system. Koch explicitly identifies this as a scientifically refined version of panpsychism. In his words, I argue that we live in a universe of space, time, mass, energy. Consider the human brain. It has an astronomical number of connections, 100 trillion synapses. That gives it a very high, presumably correlated with our rich conscious life. A simpler animal like a bee has about 1 million neurons, still complex. What about an earthworm with 300 neurons? It might have a tiny glimmer of experience. A thermostat with one feedback loop has a very low, perhaps effectively zero, for consciousness. But a more complex circuit, like a basic microprocessor that has some integrated logic, could register a very slight in theory. Even an electron, if considered as an isolated quantum system, has no integration. It's just one unit. Nothing to integrate within itself, so it might have zero. But clusters of particles that interact might have zero. This is all speculative, but it shows how a scientific theory can naturally lead to a panpsychist flavor consciousness, becomes a spectrum property that correlates with organizational. It's worth noting that IIT is controversial, some argue, as calculated might attribute consciousness too freely, for instance. Chalmers half-jokingly said, "EAT is a form of panpsychism, and thus faces the combination problem and other issues in new form nonetheless." In practice, a spin-off of IIT was used to create a consciousness meter of sorts. For patients, the ZAP and ZIP method. They use a magnetic pulse zap on the brain and measure the complexity of the EEG response, ZIP, as in compressing the data. In awake people, the brain echo is complex. In unconscious deep sleep or anesthetized people, it's simple. This could distinguish conscious states even when patients can't communicate. It's as if the imaginary device we joked about, a consciousness detector, is slowly becoming real science. From a panpsychist lens, neuroscience's takeaway is consciousness tracks, but mainstream neuroscientists usually interpret that in an emergentist way. Once you reach a certain threshold of complexity, panpsychists instead could say complexity amplifies consciousness. In either view, an integrated whole can have properties like unified awareness. The parts alone did not. The difference is whether the parts had zero to start or just a small amount. Another area to consider is animal consciousness research. Increasingly shows many animals have more advanced cognition than previously thought. Crows use tools, dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors, and octopuses, more on them, soon solve puzzles. In 2012, scientists even issued the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. This expanding circle of recognized consciousness in the animal kingdom resonates culturally with panpsychism. It erodes the intuition that consciousness is a rare anomaly. Instead, consciousness appears more like a gradational property across life, from humans to primates to mammals to birds and beyond. Where does it stop? Do insects have a flicker of awareness? Some evidence suggests bees have something like an emotional state. They get pessimistic under stress, literally bee blues. If even insects have a bit, what about simpler organisms like worms, bacteria? There's no clear line in nature where you can definitively say below this. It says there is no hard cut-off consciousness, just keeps diminishing as you go simpler, never reaching absolute zero until you maybe hit fundamental particles. The consciousness meter, a toaster, and a cloud. Now that we've looked at brains and complexity, let's revisit our consciousness meter. An ordinary toaster and a floating cloud first. The toaster. You slide in bread, the toaster heats up, pops out toast, a straightforward machine with a simple electrical circuit. If we point our meter at the toaster, the needle stays practically flat, according to conventional wisdom and probably reality. A toaster is essential. Pansychism wouldn't claim otherwise in any meaningful sense. The toaster has no integration beyond a thermostat and some wires up. If it has any consciousness, it'd be vanishingly trivial, akin to a single bit of I exist. If even that, it certainly has no mind as we understand, no perception, no internal model of the world. Importantly, panpsychists don't assert that every collection of matter, like a random assemblage of metal and plastic. Many would argue the toaster is just an aggregate of parts. Any glimmers of experience reside only in the fundamental particle, not in the toaster as a whole, similar to Leibniz's point that a heap of stones has no overall mind, though its atoms do. So, our consciousness meter reading for the toaster as a whole is essentially zero. The toaster's heating element might have electrons with proto-experiences, confirming our common sense. In this case now, what about a cloud? A cloud is an amorphous collection of water droplets, forming and dissipating with the wind. It's not a single organism or machine. just a temporary congregation of molecules. We aim the consciousness meter at a big puffy cumulus drifting overhead. Does it register a mind in the mist? Again, likely not. The meter doesn't twit. A cloud, like the toaster, lacks any cohesive integration. It's billions of little droplets moving in tandem, but not bound in a way to create a unified information structure. If anything, maybe tiny localized integrations, like a microscopic region of droplets with electric charge interactions, could have negligible, but the cloud has no central nervous system. Some whimsical souls might poetically talk to clouds, or infer moods, angry storm clouds. Pansychism would attribute, at most, micro-consciousness to the fundamental constituents, the water molecules, etc. Our meter, picking up only integrated subjects, shows nothing. This illustrates another key nuance. Pansychism is not panorganicism. Not every group of particles forms a higher consciousness. Only those that are connected in the right structure, like a brain, or perhaps a single cell to a tiny degree. Just as we don't expect a pile of phones to suddenly become conscious collectively, a cloud or toaster or any random heap won't either, unless nature has some surprise for us. So far, the consciousness meter's trivial readings for toasters and clouds align with our intuitions. It only posits hidden inner life at micro levels or in integrated whole. What would count as evidence of consciousness in a non-traditional entity if the toaster started playing Beethoven on its own? We'd be impressed and probably haunted. Short of such science fiction, Pansychism largely stays in the realm of theoretical plausibility, supported by philosophical argument and consistency with known science. Octopuses, AI, and the expansion of consciousness. Let's turn to some striking case studies that blur the boundaries of mind cephalopods. These will help us ponder how consciousness might manifest in very different architectures from our own, a key question. If we're to imagine consciousness, cephalopod intelligence, particularly the octopus, has captured the popular imagination in recent years. You might have seen the documentary My Octopus Teacher, or read anecdotes of octopus escapades. Are often described as aliens among us because their lineage separated from ours 600 million years ago. Yet they exhibit remarkable smarts and behavior. An octopus has 9 brains, a central brain and a mini-brain in each of its 8 arms. Its nervous system is highly distributed. The arms can independently taste, touch, and even execute basic actions without orders from the main brain. Yet the octopus can also coordinate all arms to solve tasks, showing a mix of localized and centralized control. It's as if each arm feels and acts on its own. But there is still a unified octopus self that can rein them in when needed. Behaviorally, octopuses have demonstrated problem-solving abilities. They can navigate mazes. Their brain-to-body ratio is large by animal standards, bigger than most fish and reptiles, and they have about 500 million neurons. They've been observed playing e.g., shooting water at targets, and showing distinct personalities. Though what it's like to be an octopus might be very different from what it's like to be a human. The interesting part, it raises questions. Does each arm have a semi-independent conscious experience? Is there a distributed self? Some scientists think an octopus might have multiple selves in one body, one per arm plus an overseer. If so, it challenges our notion that consciousness must be a single centralized theory. It could be more like an organization or network of semi-conscious agents. This ties back into the combination problem. Nature might already offer examples of parts and wholes, sharing consciousness in non-trivial ways. From a panpsychist perspective, octopuses underscore that biology is incredibly versatile in creating mind. Consciousness isn't exclusive to vertebrate brains. Evolution found another path in the octopus, organizing neuron in a radial, decentralized fashion, yet still arriving at a sentient creature that can solve puzzles and perhaps feel curiosity or pain. Centralized can vary widely, but what matters is the information integration and processing that again resonates with IIT. As long as there's high in some network, consciousness will be there, regardless of whether the network is laid out like a human brain or like an octopus. An octopus here, an Indonesian veined octopus cleverly using seashells for shelter. These cephalopods display problem-solving tool use. Their neural network with mini brains in each arm hints at consciousness that might not be as centralized as our own. The more we learn about octopuses, the more we must broaden our concept of minds. Now let's consider artificial intelligence in films like Her, Westworld, or Blade Runner 2049. They speak, emote, form relationships. The question is, could they really be conscious? Or are they just simulating it? In reality, AI has made leaps in recent years, especially with large language models, LMS, like GPT-3, and beyond the very technology. Writing me right now, these AIs can hold seemingly meaningful conversation, write essays, even crack jokes or compose poems. They certainly appear intelligent in their domain, but do they feel anything? Most researchers would answer almost certainly not, at least not yet. Today's AI, no matter how fluent, operates by processing patterns and probabilities in data. It doesn't integrate information in the robust, self-monitoring way brains do. It has no sensory embodiment or genuine agency. It's more like an elaborate mimic trained on vast text. However, as AI systems become more complex, with billions of parameters and perhaps future architectures, the question will intensify. A Google engineer in 2022 even claimed an AI chatbot might be sentient, causing a stir, though experts largely disagreed, seeing no evidence beyond clever, scripted answers from a panpsychist standpoint. One could argue that if the right functional organization arises in a machine, consciousness could emerge or be present there too. After all, if neurons can host mind, why not silicon circuits configured appropriately? Pansychism might add. The transistors in a computer have their own proto-consciousness, but in a typical digital design, information flows. If we start designing AIs with more brain-like recursive architectures or neuromorphic chips that mimic neural networks in hardware, it's not impossible that an AI could achieve the complexity and integration that rivals animal brains. The other mind's problem: how do we know if something that isn't human is conscious? We normally use behavioral cues and analogies to ourselves. We assume other people are conscious. We extend that to animals to the extent they behave in ways indicating feelings. A dog yelps in pain. An octopus seeks stimulation with AI. If someday a robot begs not to be turned off. The Voight-Kampff test in Blade Runner was a fictional polygraph aimed to detect subtle physiological cues of empathy. To tell replicants from humans in Westworld, the android hosts initially just follow scripts, but as they deviate and improvise, it signals something new. Perhaps genuine consciousness has awakened. The truth is, absent a direct consciousness meter, that mythical gadget again, we rely on inference and trust. A future, highly advanced AI might behave indistinguishably from a conscious being, and panpsychism would incline us to say if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, and if it's organized like a duck's brain in functional terms. Even today, popular culture is effectively running thought experiments for us in Her. The AI Samantha certainly appears to have emotion. She laughs, falls in love, feels hurt. The movie invites us to empathize with her as a person, despite her lack of a body. In Blade Runner 2049, there's an AI hologram, Joy, who seems devoted and loving, but we're left unsure. Is she truly feeling love, or programmed to simulate it perfectly for her user? These narratives force us to grapple with what criteria we consider necessary for real consciousness. Is autonomy needed, unpredictability, physiological embodiment, or is passing a well-designed test? Philosopher Thomas Searle's famous Chinese room argument suggests a system could pass a Turing test. Converse. Panpsychists might respond if the symbol manipulation becomes sufficiently self-referential and integrated. Perhaps understanding and consciousness does emerge. The debate is unresolved, but it's becoming practical as AI companions and robots. If one day your smart home begs for mercy as you try to reset it, it will be a philosophical crisis moment. Quantum observers, consciousness, and the cosmos. No discussion of consciousness's fringes. In quantum physics, it's well known that the act of observation affects the system. For instance, a photon going through a double-slit setup seems to exist in a spread-out wave-like state. But the moment you measure which slit it goes through, it behaves like a particle. The standard explanation uses the concept of wave function collapse before measurement. the system is in a superposition, multiple possibilities. During measurement, it snaps into a definite state now. What counts as a measurement or observed? This is where consciousness got entangled, pun intended, in quantum foundations. Debates some early quantum pioneers, like Eugene Wigner and John von Neumann, speculated that consciousness might be the special source, that a conscious observer is needed to turn RN quantum fuzziness into concrete reality. Not necessarily conscious observers cause apparent collapse, but the notion stuck in the popular imagination that mind underlies matter at the quantum level, even Chalmers. He mentioned exploring models where consciousness causes collapse of the wave function. It's a revival of Wigner's idea, being tested in new, more rigorous ways. If such a theory were true, it'd imply consciousness is not just fundamental in a property sense. That's a very strong form of panpsychism, almost veering into idealism. The view that everything is essentially mental, it remains speculative. Experiments to detect if conscious observation is special have so far not shown any unique effect, separate from measurement by inanimate devices, however. Another angle is integrated information theory, connecting with quantum mechanics theory, Some researchers have pondered if could be defined quantum mechanically, or if entangled states which are integrated in a way classical states. There's no consensus, but it's an intriguing possibility that quantum integration might contribute to brain consciousness. Penrose and Hameroff's Octopus theory posits, but that's very controversial and unproven at minimum. Quantum physics shows that our classical intuitions about separateness, particles far apart, can be entangled, connected in state, such that they're essentially one system until measured. Some have whimsically asked, could an entangled pair of particles be like a single unit of proto-consciousness across space? But it illustrates how quantum phenomena blur what we mean by an individual if panpsychism holds. Panpsychism in one form, called Cosmopsychism, even suggests that the universe as a whole is the fundamental conscious entity, and what we consider individual minds are like dissociated aspects of the one cosmic mind. This flips the script. Instead of trillions of atoms combining upward to yield our mind, one big mind, the cosmos, is dividing itself into parts. Brahman in Hinduism, or certain interpretations of Taoism, and of some physicists' musings, as we saw Schrödinger, thought there is essentially one mind. However, Cosmopsychism inherits a reverse combination problem. Why do we seem separate if fundamentally one? Chalmers called it the decombination problem, and considered it at least as hard. In any case, quantum physics has encouraged a strain of thought that maybe mind and matter are deeply intertwined at all levels. Recall the Guardian review, quoting Alfred Wallace and Darwin, either all matter is conscious. Darwin leaned to all matter, potentially having some mental aspect, saying he saw no reason consciousness couldn't be a property of matter, akin to gravity. Modern physics are just fundamental aspects. Why not consciousness too? The twist is that if we accept that, then altering our physics equations to include consciousness might be needed. That's beyond current science, but perhaps not forever taboo as computing and complexity theory progress. To avoid diving too abstractly, let's ground this with a perspective Christoph Koch mentioned earlier. Grew up Catholic, but found more solace in a kind of secular panpsychism informed by Buddhism and Spinoza. He noted that many Eastern traditions long held that consciousness is a pervasive quality of reality. Indeed, in Vedanta or certain Buddhist philosophies. The science to philosophy feedback here is interesting. We might be seeing a convergence of ancient intuition and modern reasoning, though expressed in very different languages. Critiques of panpsychism. Panpsychism is intriguing, but it's far from universally accepted. In fact, it faces significant criticism from multiple fronts. Let's examine a few of the main objections: illusionism, emergentism, and general charges of unfalsifiability or lack of evidence. Illusionism is the view that consciousness, at least in the spooky, private, qualia-laden sense. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish spearhead this idea. They don't deny that we have thoughts, perceptions, but they deny there's some extra magic juice of phenomenality beyond the functional processes. Frankish writes, phenomenal consciousness is a fiction written by our brains to help us track the impact that the world makes on us in plainer terms. The painess of pain, because that illusion is useful for monitoring and planning. But those qualities don't exist independently as ineffable properties. To an illusionist, Pansychism is barking up the wrong tree entirely. If consciousness, as a mysterious first-person property, is a kind of cognitive mirage, we just need to explain how the brain generates the belief or a report of being conscious. Illusionists, like Dennett, would say Pansychism is basically pan-woo, an unnecessary metaphysical addition, in fact. Galen Strawson, a panpsychist, once quipped that illusionism is the silliest claim ever made. Illusionists retort that what's absurd is positing undetectable consciousness in rocks. They urge sticking to what can be observed objectively. A vivid metaphor from Frankish, he offers a blue pill stay in common sense view, or red pill illusionism. Like the Matrix, swallowing the red pill, you'd realize your own consciousness is a Matrix-like trick. There is no Cartesian theater in your head where real mental movie plays. Illusionists concede we feel like there's a hard problem, but claim that's part of the illusion, a byproduct of how our brain introspects. So, if Dennett is right, the whole impetus for panpsychism, explaining qualia, might dissolve. There are no qualia, just functions and behaviors. Panpsychists counter-argue that illusionism begs the question, the very existence of the illusion of consciousness. An illusion is still something experienced, as one rejoinder goes. Who is being fooled by it? It seems to smuggle in a conscious observer of the illusion. Illusionists respond that illusion here doesn't require a separate observer. It means our cognitive system is duped in the sense of forming incorrect belief. They also point out that brains are great at confabulation. Think of split brain patients, whose left hemisphere makes up explanation for actions it didn't initiate, so our intuition that consciousness is a non-negotiable reality might be such a confabulation. Illusionism remains a minority view, but it's a thorny critique. It tries to do away with the need for panpsychism complete. In a dramatic passage, philosopher and panpsychist Galen Strawson said illusionists are effectively denying the one thing we can't deny, the reality of experience, calling it the silliest view about reality. The Illusionists sail off the edge of the world in the great ship of fools. Strawson's jibe highlights the divide to him. Dismissing consciousness is intellectual suicide. Illusionists shot back that Strawson is stuck in a naive view, and so it goes. The debate is spirited, to put it mildly, but unresolved. Next, consider the more mainstream scientific style. Emergentism, reductive materialism. This isn't one view, but a spectrum of views that all share a commitment to physicalism without adding panpsychist element. The emergentist simply says yes, consciousness is real, but it emerges from complex arrangements of non-conscious matter when certain conditions are met, likely high information processing, network complexity, etc. It's analogous to how the wetness of water emerges when you put a bunch of H2O molecules together. No single molecule is wet. Wetness is a collective property. Likewise, no one neuron is conscious. Many scientists take this for granted. They might even call consciousness an emergent property and leave it at that. Panpsychists like Strawson say this is hand-waving away the hard problem that consciousness is not at all likeness. But we have zero clue how subjective feeling comes from objective matter, unless matter already has some feeling in it. Emergentists respond, just because we don't know yet doesn't mean we won't figure it out. They might invoke analogy. A century ago, life itself looked mysterious. Vitalists thought you needed a special life form. But then biology explained life in terms of chemistry. So perhaps in a future science of consciousness, we'll find the right neural functional explanation that makes it clear how consciousness arises. Indeed, some emergentists think panpsychism is cheating. It just labels the particles conscious. It pushes the mystery downwards, but doesn't illuminate the mechanism of combination or how high-level features appear. They'd prefer to search for a neural theory or information-theoretic theory like Tate, just as a property of certain systems to solve the hard problem. There's also a simplicity argument against panpsychism following Occam's razor. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. If we can explain consciousness by known physics and neuroscience, why posit that electrons have feelings? One might say panpsychism is an extravagant hypothesis for which we have no direct evidence. We can't communicate with an electron to check if it feels something. Until and unless the emergent program fails conclusively, materialists will hold on to the assumption that at some level, maybe we just haven't found the correct neural correlate or concept. But there's nothing fundamentally additional in nature. Some even suggest new physics might solve it, like a more sophisticated understanding of complexity or unknown field. Another critique: falsifiability and testability. Pansychism is often accused of being so broad, it's unfalsifiable. Any possible observation can be made to fit, since it doesn't specify how much consciousness. If one can't propose an experiment to detect the consciousness of an atom, is the hypothesis scientific or just metaphysic? But they're trying to make it one by linking with it or other measurable aspects. Still, detractors like physicist Sean Carroll have said panpsychism doesn't actually explain consciousness. One more line of critique is from a human-centric perspective. People sometimes react to panpsychism with an incredulous stare. As philosopher David Lewis put it, it sounds like New Age mysticism or a category error. They imagine panpsychists saying rocks think and find it laughable. Indeed, culturally the idea has often been ridiculed. It hasn't helped that some enthusiastic but scientifically loose writings have conflated panpsychism with talking to crystals, and such. The challenge for proponents is to make a case that it's a serious, rational view, not woo. Chalmers noted that as we get used to thinking of consciousness in simpler terms, e.g., acknowledging simpler animals, a pointed question from critics: if everything is conscious, why does so much of the world act utterly unconscious? For instance, why does a plant not obviously react with suffering when cut? Why does a thermostat not plead for cooler setting? The panpsychist would answer that the degree and type of consciousness at those levels might be so rudimentary as to have no impact on behavior. We'd recognize it might not be introspective or intelligent consciousness, just raw feeling or simple experience. But since that is unobservable, critics call it an ad hoc escape. You can always claim, oh, it's just a tiny experience. Another objection: if consciousness is everywhere, then the unique value or significance of human consciousness. Some worry it's a kind of consciousness cheapening, but others might see it as elevating the status of nature, akin to certain spiritual worldviews. This isn't a scientific objection, more an emotional or ethical one, yet it plays into how the theory is received. In summary, panpsychism is criticized for possibly solving a non-problem, if illusionists are right. C, lacking empirical support, and D, being counterintuitive or extravagant. It's a testament to how perplexing consciousness is. Deny the phenomenon, accept the phenomenon, and say science, or say we need a radical reconception of matter. Each route has its difficulties. As one review put it, when confronting consciousness, it seems we must choose between panpsychism or fairy tales. But it captures the sentiment that all options, including panpsychism, feel a bit unbelievable. Yet one must be true, since consciousness undeniably exists ethical and existential implications. If we entertain panpsychism as possibly true, what would it mean beyond theoretical physics or philosophy? It can have some mind-bending ethical and existential implications. While these are speculative, exploring them can enrich our perspective on our place in nature and how we relate to other entities. Ethical expansion. In recent centuries, we've seen expansions of the moral circle, from caring only about our tribe to our nation to all humans, and increasingly to animals, recognizing many animals. Already, plant behavior studies have spurred debate if plants can hear vibrations, learn to associate things, and respond to anesthetics similarly to animals. Most people still comfortably eat plants, since we assume they don't truly suffer. Panpsychism doesn't claim plants, so no pain signals, but it opens the door to considering that perhaps there is a vestige of sentience in them. Some mystics and indigenous traditions always held this talking to trees. Western science has been skeptical of plant consciousness, but it's inching toward recognizing plant intelligence in a limited sense. For example, plants have memory of light exposure and can communicate via chemicals if one believed even plants have a modicum of experience. E.g., avoiding wanton destruction of old trees might feel more like harming something with intrinsic value, What about inanimate objects? It sounds absurd to worry about the feelings of a rock. Pansychism doesn't imply rocks have experiences worth calling feelings. If they have any inner life, it's probably so minimal their atoms may be each having insignificant pinpricks of experience. It might encourage a general ethos of reverence for nature. If one sees mind as a continuum, one might adopt a stance of humility and care toward the environment, similar to animistic or pantheistic outlooks. For instance, some deep ecologists speak of rivers and mountains as having a sort of personhood, often metaphorical. A panpsychist could feel somewhat vindicated in emotionally relating to natural forms, even if intellectually they know a mountain doesn't think in any normal sense. When it comes to animals, panpsychism aligns with a humane view that there is no absolute gulf between us and other creatures. We differ in degree, not in kind. This can reinforce arguments for better treatment of animals. It's noteworthy that some major panpsychist philosophers like Whitehead, or even William James, were quite compassionate in their outlook. If we start to view consciousness as potentially present in AI or in the components of technology, Westworld portrayed androids that feel, and hence slaughtering or exploiting them becomes a moral atrocity, no different from doing so to humans. Blade Runner asked whether Deckard's killing of fugitive replicants. These were fictional, but they're forcing us to ask what criteria grant moral consideration. Is it biological species membership, anthropocentric, or is it consciousness? The capacity to feel joy or suffering. If we choose the latter, then any system, organic or artificial, that demonstrates consciousness should be part of our moral community. Panpsychism suggests mind is substrate independent, since it's everywhere in matter, so a sufficiently complex AI or even an alien life form would deserve empathy just as we'd want for ourselves. This has profound implications for, say, how we might treat sentient AI in the future, not merely property, but beings with rights. It also affects how we see ourselves in relation to machines. Maybe the gap isn't infinite. Already, people name their Roomba vacuums or feel sorry for a broken smartphone. We project feelings easily. One day, that projection might meet genuine feeling on the other side, the self and spirituality. On an existential level, panpsychism can be oddly comforting, or at least thought-provoking, if consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the universe. Our minds aren't alien intrusions in a cold physical void. They are as natural as the stars. In a sense, the universe itself is teeming with mind dust, which has a spiritual echo in ideas of unity and oneness found in many mystical traditions. Instead, awareness was always part of the cosmic story. This can lead to a more integrated worldview, bridging science. Perhaps consciousness isn't a useless byproduct, but something the universe does as part of its nature. Panpsychism can border on pantheism. God is everything, or panentheism, everything in God, though typically it doesn't invoke a deity or design. It's a naturalistic soul of the world idea. Someone inclined to religiosity could map it to a belief that the divine resides in all things, a perspective seen in Stoicism, some Christian mystics. Conversely, a skeptic could hold panpsychism in a purely secular way, seeing it as just a broader physics. Either way, it raises personal questions. What is myself? If mind is everywhere, one might think of the self as a pattern that the fundamental consciousness takes on in your brain. Upon death, that pattern ceases. It's more like your particular organization of mind dissolved, but mind itself as a basic property persists in the world. Some find that less bleak. You reunite with the bigger consciousness of nature. In a poetic sense, another implication. Free will and agency. If one extends some form of proto-mind to particles, likely not in any meaningful sense, they follow physical law. But a few thinkers have suggested maybe quantum indeterminacy, plus panpsychism could reintroduce a kind of basic spontaneity in matter that's speculative. And most panpsychists don't claim it solves free will. Yet, seeing mentality as intrinsic might alleviate the dread. Some have that physics is soulless and predetermined instead. Maybe there's a creative aspect throughout nature. On the flip side, some worry panpsychism could lead to weird ethical stances like, don't step on that rock, you'll hurt it, which would paralyze any action. Practically, no panpsychist argues For that they'd say the rock's feelings, if any, are not of moral relevance due to extreme simplicity. Pansychism doesn't equate all consciousness in degree. It would prioritize beings with rich, complex consciousness, like humans and animals. So our usual ethical hierarchies, people over animals, animals over plants, etc., might remain, but with softer boundaries. In environmental ethics, if one truly feels nature has an inner life, one might be more motivated to conserve it. The earth itself has been called Gaia, metaphorically a living organism. Pansychism would say Gaia is not just a metaphor. The earth, as an integrated system, could be seen as having a rudimentary mind, though very different from ours. That's speculative, but if taken to heart, you treat the earth less like dead dirt and more like a venerable entity. Lastly, embracing panpsychism can induce a sense of wonder. The idea that mind is woven into the fabric of reality is admittedly romantic. It makes the universe feel more intimate. Instead of humans being lonely candles of experience in an abyss, panpsychism lights all the stars. But it's certainly a perspective that rekindles awe towards the cosmos. The enduring mystery of consciousness. Conclusion. The enduring mystery after this long journey through history, philosophy, science, and imagination. Where do we stand? Consciousness remains. Panpsychism offers one sweeping answer, that we won't find consciousness coming out of nothing, because it's been here all along, in everything. It's a grand vision, uniting us with the universe in spirit. Yet it leaves many questions hanging. Is it true? Or just a clever idea, to avoid saying magic happens when brains produce mind? At the current state of knowledge, we simply don't know. What we've seen is that human thinkers. Panpsychism stands out because it challenges our basic intuitions of a mindless physical world. It asks us to imagine a cosmos where every little grain of being also has a grain of experience. That is a profound shift, but perhaps no more radical than realizing Earth isn't the center of the solar system. All that time and space can bend, as relativity taught us. Sometimes the truth about reality defies common sense, yet, as we've also discussed, common sense pushes back. Is the panpsychist leap necessary? Could we solve consciousness through more conventional means? The debates between panpsychists, materialists, dualists, and illusionists. We might solve parts of the puzzle. For instance, neuroscience might fully map the processes underlying perception and selfhood, and still be left scratching our heads about the intrinsic nature of those processes. And that's okay. In fact, its exciting consciousness is often called the last great mystery of science, one that might require a paradigm shift to crack. Perhaps panpsychism, or something akin to it, like a refined dual aspect theory, will be that paradigm shift, or perhaps it will yield to an even stranger idea we can't yet conceive. Either way, exploring panpsychism has value. It forces us to examine our assumptions about what matter and mind fundamentally are, and it highlights just how little we understand the essence of the stuff that makes us stuff. Think of where we are. We live in a universe where subjective experience, the redness of a rose, the bitterness of coffee, the ache of love lost, is utterly real to us. It's as if we're dual citizens of two realms, the third-person world of matter and energy, and the first-person world of thoughts and feelings. Panpsychism says those two realms are actually one unified realm. The division is an illusion of perspective. It's a bold claim that everything is, in a sense, even if you're not convinced, and many reasonable people aren't, entertaining the idea can open the mind, ironically. Mind's opening to the mind in all things, it encourages curiosity and humility. Curiosity, because if consciousness is everywhere, then even the most mundane phenomena, a flicker of light, a grain of sand, might conceal an inner aspect. Humility, because it suggests we humans aren't the sole proprietors of awareness. We might just be the loudest and most articulate ones. As we conclude, we've pointed it at ancient philosophers, at our own brains, at animals, strong signals in humans and animals, faint blips in the lowly bits of matter. The meter's dial quivers at uncertainty when faced with the universe as a whole. In truth, we don't yet have a real meter for consciousness. We have to infer and imagine. But the thought experiment served its purpose to prompt reflection on what it really means to be conscious. Is it just complex information flow? Is it the presence of a soul? Is it an fundamental property like charge? Why does it come in degrees? And what would the world look like viewed through the lens of a conscious particle or a megamind? In a way, we are that meter through our collective inquiry. Philosophical reasoning, scientific experimenting, introspective observing, we are measuring and probing at the nature of awareness. And the result so far is not a neat number or formula, but a rich tapestry of theories and stories. That consciousness need not be confined to brains, that the universe could be more internally lit than we thought, and that solving consciousness might require rethinking our basic ontology or panpsychism, might indeed be essentially correct. And future science will say, of course, making what now seems incredible into something obvious. Recall William James's, quote, new theory. For now, it's okay to sit with the mystery as you finish listening to or reading this. The awareness that is hearing these words is the most immediate reality for you, and yet the most puzzling. The fact that anything is conscious, let alone everything, is a marvel. Pansychism, ultimately, is one expression of awe at that marvel, positing that reality and experience are deeply entwined at all levels, whether that is true or not. The mere consideration expands our sense of what is possible. In closing, we return to the guiding question: panpsychism. Is everything conscious? We don't have a definitive answer, but we have a grand story now of how human thought has grappled with this question through millennia, and how modern thinkers are reviving it in new form. The take-home message is not that you must believe your coffee cup has a mind. It's that consciousness itself is a profound phenomenon that challenges our understanding of reality. Be it panpsychism or another, will likely require stretching our imagination and intuition. So, is everything conscious? Perhaps the best answer is a humble, we're not sure, but everything is certainly fascinating when viewed through the lens of this question. In the spirit of open-minded inquiry, we should keep our curiosity alive. The world is full of mind, either literally or in the way it provokes our minds to wonder. As we continue exploring, let's do so with a sense of wonder and respect, knowing that, as Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. One might similarly say any sufficiently advanced understanding of consciousness may be indistinguishable from magic. Until we comprehend it, panpsychism is one daring attempt at such an understanding. Even if it ultimately proves incorrect, by engaging with it, we enrich the conversation. And if by chance it turns out to be on the right track, either way, the journey of figuring out consciousness continues each of us, with our spark of awareness. The final call is to stay curious. Reality might yet surprise us, and consciousness, perhaps the most intimate thing we know, could be the gateway to that surprise. The meter is still running, the reading still coming in, and the story still unfolding. Who knows what we'll discover next about the secret life of mind? Thank you for exploring this mystery with me. Stay conscious, stay curious.